Some nights end with applause, and some end in silence so complete it feels like the world itself is holding its breath. On August 26, 1990, under the fading glow of a Wisconsin night, one of the greatest guitarists who ever lived stepped off a stage after delivering what would become his final performance. Stevie Ray Vaughan, known for pouring raw emotion into every note, had just played to thousands. The crowd roared, the music echoed, and for a brief moment, everything felt exactly as it should. But just hours later, somewhere beyond the lights and noise, a helicopter lifted into the dark. It never made it to its destination. No mayday call, no warning, just a sudden disappearance into the night. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, it was already too late. What happened in those final moments has been investigated, analyzed, and debated for decades. But the truth is far more unsettling than any rumor, because it wasn't a single dramatic failure. It was something quieter, subtler, and far more human. Before we begin, if you're drawn to real, deeply researched stories like this, stories that don't just tell you what happened, but make you feel it, make sure to subscribe to the channel. These stories take time, detail, and care to tell properly, and your support helps keep them coming. This is the story of the helicopter crash that ended the life of Stevie Ray Vaughan. On the night of August 25, 1990, Alpine Valley Music Theater in East Troy, Wisconsin, was alive with energy. It was the final stop of a summer tour that had already become legendary. The lineup itself felt almost unreal, Stevie Ray Vaughan sharing the stage with blues giants like Eric Clapton, Buddy Guy, Robert Cray, and Jimmy Vaughan, Stevie's older brother. The show had been built as a celebration of blues music, a gathering of masters who rarely shared the same stage. For Stevie, this moment carried even more weight. Just a few years earlier, his life had been on a very different path. Struggling with addiction, physically drained, and creatively at risk of burning out, he had reached a breaking point. In 1986, he collapsed after a tour in Europe and entered rehab soon after. It was a turning point. By 1990, Stevie Ray Vaughan was not just back, he was reborn. Clean, focused, and fully in control of his craft, he had returned to the stage with a clarity that many close to him described as transformative. His playing had become even more precise, yet somehow more emotional. Every performance felt intentional. Every note carried weight. And that night in Wisconsin was no exception. The concert stretched late into the evening. One by one, the artists took the stage, trading solos and sharing moments that fans would talk about for years. As the night progressed, the atmosphere shifted from excitement to something deeper, something almost reverent. Stevie's performance stood out. There was an intensity to it. Not reckless, not chaotic, but focused, controlled. Those who were there would later describe it as one of his best. But like all performances, it had to end. As the final notes faded and the crowd began to disperse into the night, the backstage area shifted from energy to logistics. Equipment was packed. Crew members coordinated departures. Artists made their plans for the next destination. Stevie Ray Vaughan was scheduled to leave quickly. The next stop required immediate travel, and helicopters had been arranged to transport members of the touring group from Alpine Valley to Chicago's Midway Airport. From there, they would catch connecting flights. It wasn't unusual. For major touring acts, especially after late-night performances, helicopters were often used to save time and avoid long overnight drives. That night, several helicopters were waiting nearby. Among them was a Bell 206B Jet Ranger, a single-engine helicopter commonly used for short passenger flights. It was a reliable aircraft, widely operated, and considered safe when flown within proper conditions. The pilot assigned to that helicopter was Jeff Brown. Brown was not an amateur. He was a commercially licensed pilot with experience flying similar routes and aircraft. The flight itself was expected to be routine. A short trip, roughly 15 minutes, from the venue to the airport. Nothing about it stood out as dangerous. But the conditions that night were not ideal. It was late past midnight. The rural area surrounding Alpine Valley was dark, with minimal ground lighting. And more importantly, a layer of fog had begun to settle over the region. Not a dramatic storm, Not heavy rain, just low visibility. The kind that doesn't seem threatening at first glance. The kind that can quietly change everything. As passengers were being assigned to helicopters, a small but crucial decision took place. Originally, Stevie Ray Vaughan was not scheduled to be on that particular aircraft. Instead, he had been planning to travel with his band members. But at some point during the departure process, there was a change. Seats were limited. Timing mattered. And Vaughan accepted a spot on one of the helicopters that had been arranged for Eric Clapton's team. Alongside him were 3 members of Clapton's crew: tour manager Bobby Brooks, bodyguard Nigel Brown, and assistant Colin Smythe. For passengers, 1 pilot, a short flight ahead. No one involved had any reason to believe this would be anything other than routine. There were no reported mechanical issues with the helicopter before departure. No emergency alerts. No visible signs of malfunction. The aircraft had been operating normally, but the environment was beginning to shift. Around the landing area, visibility was decreasing. Fog, especially at night, is not always obvious from the ground. Can appear thin, almost harmless. But once airborne, especially in areas without strong visual references like city lights or clear horizons, it can become disorienting. For helicopter pilots, especially in 1990, this was a known risk. The Bell 206B Jet Ranger was not equipped for full instrument flight under all conditions. It relied heavily on visual cues, what the pilot could see outside the cockpit. And that night, there wasn't much to see. Still, the departures began. One by one, helicopters lifted off into the darkness. There was no panic, no urgency, just the steady, routine movement of aircraft leaving the venue. At approximately 12:50 a.m., the helicopter carrying Stevie Ray Vaughan lifted into the air. From the ground, it looked like any other departure. A smooth ascent, a steady climb, navigation lights fading into the distance. For a brief moment, everything seemed normal. But within seconds of takeoff, something changed. The helicopter did not gain the altitude expected for its route. Instead, it remained unusually low. Witnesses on the ground would later recall that it disappeared quickly into the fog, its lights vanishing faster than anticipated. There was no visible struggle, no erratic movement, just disappearance. Then, less than a minute after takeoff, the helicopter struck the side of a ski hill. The impact occurred at high speed. There was no distress call, no indication from the pilot that anything was wrong, no attempt to turn back. The crash site was located just a short distance from the takeoff point, so close that it suggested something had gone wrong almost immediately after liftoff. But at that moment, no one knew. From the perspective of those still at the venue, the helicopter had simply departed into the night. Minutes passed, then more. At first, there was no reason for concern. The flight was short. The expectation was that all helicopters would arrive in Chicago without issue. But as time stretched on, something began to feel off. One by one, the other helicopters arrived safely. Passengers disembarked. Plans continued. Movements remained orderly, except for one aircraft that never arrived. Communication attempts were made. No response. Still, there was hesitation to assume the worst. In aviation, delays can happen. Routes can change. Radios can fail temporarily. But as the minutes turned into nearly an hour, uncertainty began to harden into concern. Back near Alpine Valley, the reality was already taking shape. Emergency responders were alerted after reports of a crash in the area. The location was difficult, rural terrain, darkness, and fog complicating visibility. As rescue teams moved toward the reported site, they didn't yet know who was on board, only that a helicopter had gone down shortly after takeoff, and that there were likely no survivors. By the time emergency responders reached the crash site, the outcome was already clear. The helicopter had gone down on the side of a ski hill, less than a mile from where it had taken off. The terrain itself wasn't extreme, but in the darkness and fog, it had effectively become invisible. The aircraft had impacted the ground at high speed, leaving no chance for survival. There was no fire large enough to spread beyond the immediate wreckage. No scattered debris fields stretching across a wide area. The crash was concentrated, sudden, and final. All 5 people on board were killed instantly. In the hours that followed, the identities of the passengers began to circulate quietly among those connected to the tour. Then, inevitably, the news reached a wider audience. Stevie Ray Vaughan was gone, at just 35 years old. For fans, the loss felt unreal. For those who had just seen him perform hours earlier, it was almost impossible to process. The transition from a stage filled with life and music to a silent crash site in the dark felt too abrupt, too final. But for investigators, the focus had to shift quickly. What happened in those final seconds? Because on the surface, nothing about the flight had suggested imminent danger. The National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, began its investigation with a basic but critical understanding. This was not a long flight. The helicopter had not been cruising at altitude for minutes. It had not encountered changing weather mid-route. Whatever went wrong happened almost immediately after takeoff. The wreckage location confirmed that. The helicopter had traveled only a short distance forward before colliding with rising terrain. There was no evidence of a prolonged attempt to recover. No signs of evasive maneuvering that might suggest the pilot had seen the hill at the last second. Instead, the impact angle told a quieter, more troubling story. The aircraft had flown directly into the terrain. Controlled. The speed. This type of accident has a name in aviation. Controlled flight into terrain, CFIT. It occurs when an aircraft is fully functional, under pilot control, but the pilot is unaware of their proximity to the ground, until it's too late. It is not caused by mechanical failure. It is not caused by an explosion or a sudden loss of control. It is caused by something far more subtle and far more dangerous. Disorientation. To understand how this could happen, investigators turned their attention to the conditions at the time of departure. Weather reports from the area confirmed what witnesses had described. Low clouds and fog had developed over the region during the late hours of the night. Visibility was significantly reduced, especially at low altitudes. Importantly, this wasn't a dramatic storm system. There were no thunderheads, no lightning, no heavy winds, just a low ceiling and limited visibility. The kind of conditions that can be deceptive. From the ground, especially under artificial lighting, it might not seem severe. But once airborne, particularly in a rural environment with minimal light references, a pilot can quickly lose their sense of orientation. This is known as spatial disorientation, and it can happen in seconds. Human perception relies heavily on visual cues to maintain balance and orientation. When those cues disappear, when the horizon is no longer visible, when the ground blends into darkness or fog, the brain begins to misinterpret motion. Up can feel like forward. Level flight can feel like a climb. A gradual descent can go completely unnoticed. For pilots flying under visual flight rules, VFR, these illusions are a known hazard. And on that night, Jeff Brown was flying under VFR. The Bell 206B Jet Ranger, while a capable aircraft, was not certified for the kind of instrument-only navigation required in dense fog or low cloud ceilings. It depended on the pilot being able to see and interpret the outside environment. But shortly after takeoff, that environment likely disappeared. Investigators reconstructed the probable sequence. After lifting off from Alpine Valley, the helicopter began its initial climb. Under normal conditions, the pilot would use visual landmarks, lights on the ground, the horizon, terrain features, to maintain orientation and ensure a safe ascent path. But in the fog, those references would have been obscured almost immediately. With no clear horizon and limited ground visibility, the pilot would have had to rely on instruments, altimeter, attitude indicator, vertical speed to maintain proper flight. But here's where the situation becomes critical. Transitioning from visual flight to instrument reliance is not automatic. It requires training, discipline, and, most importantly, preparation. If a pilot is not expecting to enter instrument conditions, or is only partially relying on instruments, there can be a delay, a hesitation, a moment where the brain still tries to interpret unreliable visual input. And in that moment, errors can compound. The helicopter's path suggests that it did not climb sufficiently after takeoff. Instead, it maintained a relatively low altitude, directly along a path that intersected with the rising terrain of the ski hill. Without clear visual cues and possibly experiencing spatial disorientation, the pilot may have believed the aircraft was climbing more than it actually was. Or worse, may not have realized the terrain was rising ahead at all. There was no evidence of mechanical failure. The engine was functioning. The rotor system showed no signs of pre-impact malfunction. Flight controls were consistent with normal operation. The helicopter, in every mechanical sense, was working, which left only one conclusion. The accident was caused by controlled flight into terrain due to spatial disorientation in low visibility conditions. But even with that conclusion, questions remained. Why take off in those conditions? Why not delay? Why not wait for visibility to improve? The answers are not dramatic. They are human. The pressure to move. The assumption that the flight would be short. The familiarity with similar conditions in the past. In aviation, especially in routine operations, risk doesn't always feel like risk. It feels like inconvenience. Fog becomes something to push through, not something to avoid. Time becomes a factor. Schedules matter. And when nothing has gone wrong before, it's easy to believe nothing will go wrong now. There was no indication that the pilot was reckless. No evidence of negligence in the traditional sense. Just a decision made under conditions that didn't seem immediately dangerous. But aviation doesn't always give second chances. Once the helicopter entered that fog, the margin for error collapsed. And unlike larger aircraft equipped for full instrument flight, there was little room to recover from even a brief loss of orientation. The absence of a distress call reinforces this. There was no time to recognize the danger, no time to correct it, no time to communicate. From takeoff to impact, less than a minute passed. For the passengers, there would have been no warning, no gradual realization, just a normal departure that never became a flight. As the investigation continued, the findings were clear, clinical, and precise. But they could not capture the full weight of what had been lost. Because this wasn't just an aviation accident. It was the sudden end of a life that had just begun to stabilize. A career that had been rebuilt. A future that, only hours earlier, had felt wide open. And all of it ended not with a dramatic failure, but with a quiet, invisible hazard hidden in the dark. By sunrise, the silence was gone. In its place, a different kind of noise began to spread. Phone calls, confirmations, names being spoken carefully, as if saying them too loudly might make the reality settle in faster. Within hours, what had started as a quiet concern turned into a confirmed tragedy. The helicopter that never arrived had crashed. And among those on board was Stevie Ray Vaughan. For the people who had been there that night, the emotional impact was immediate and disorienting. Just hours earlier, they had watched him perform, alive, focused, completely in control. There had been no sign that anything was wrong. No indication that this would be the last time. Eric Clapton, who had shared the stage with Vaughan that evening, was among the first to learn the news. The realization came not as a gradual understanding, but as a shock, sudden and absolute. Members of the touring group, crew, and musicians were left trying to process how a routine departure had turned into something irreversible. There is a particular kind of grief that follows accidents like this. Not drawn out, not anticipated, but instant. The kind that leaves no space to prepare. As the day unfolded, the crash site became a place of quiet investigation. Authorities secured the area, documenting the wreckage, mapping the debris, and beginning the methodical process of understanding what had happened. The terrain told part of the story. The helicopter had struck the hillside at a shallow angle, consistent with forward flight. There were no deep gouges suggesting a last-second attempt to pull up sharply. No wide arc of debris indicating a loss of control before impact. Everything pointed back to the same conclusion. The aircraft had been under control, until the moment it wasn't. For investigators, the evidence was consistent. For the public, it was harder to accept, because there was no single dramatic cause to point to, no explosion, no catastrophic failure, no clear moment where everything visibly went wrong. Instead, the cause was something intangible: fog, darkness, disorientation, conditions that don't feel dangerous until they are. In the weeks that followed, the NTSB released its findings. The official cause of the accident was determined to be the pilot's failure to maintain sufficient altitude and clearance from terrain, due to spatial disorientation brought on by low visibility conditions. It was a precise explanation, technically accurate, but emotionally incomplete, because it didn't answer the question that many people kept returning to: how could something so small lead to something so final? The answer lies in how aviation risk actually works. Most accidents are not the result of a single dramatic mistake. They are the result of small factors aligning: a late-night departure, reduced visibility, a short flight that feels routine, an aircraft not equipped for full instrument conditions, a pilot making a decision that on another night might have been completely uneventful. Individually, none of these are extraordinary. Together, they can be fatal. And that's what makes accidents like this so unsettling. Because there is no clear villain, no obvious failure, just a chain of circumstances that, once set in motion, becomes impossible to break. For Stevie Ray Vaughan's family, the loss was deeply personal. His brother, Jimmy Vaughan, had been part of that same performance just hours earlier. The two had shared the stage, something that carried its own emotional significance, given how far Stevie had come in rebuilding his life. Now, that moment would become something else entirely: the last time they played together. For fans, the loss extended beyond music. Vaughan wasn't just a guitarist. He was part of a revival. In the 1980s, blues music had faded from mainstream attention. Vaughan helped bring it back, introducing a new generation to a sound that was raw, expressive, and deeply rooted in emotion. His playing wasn't polished in a commercial sense. It was honest. Every note carried weight. Every performance felt immediate. And just as he reached a point of clarity in his life, free from addiction, fully present in his craft, that voice was silenced. The reaction from the music world was immediate. Tributes came from artists across genres, not just because of his skill, but because of what he represented: resilience, reinvention, a second chance. That didn't last as long as it should have. In the years that followed, the crash became more than an isolated tragedy. It became a case study. Within aviation circles, it reinforced a lesson that had already been learned many times before, but needed to be remembered again. Controlled flight into terrain remains one of the most persistent causes of aviation accidents, especially in conditions involving low visibility. And the pattern is often the same: a functioning aircraft, an experienced pilot, a situation that appears manageable, until it isn't. Since 1990, advancements in technology have helped reduce these risks. Terrain awareness and warning systems, TAWS, have been developed to alert pilots when they are dangerously close to the ground. Improved training emphasizes the dangers of spatial disorientation, especially during night operations in poor visibility. Stricter adherence to instrument flight requirements has also reduced the likelihood of pilots entering conditions they are not fully equipped to handle. But even with these improvements, the fundamental risk hasn't disappeared, because it's not just about technology. It's about human perception. And human perception is not always reliable, especially in the dark, especially in the fog. The crash that took Stevie Ray Vaughan's life did not involve a dramatic sequence of failures. There was no prolonged struggle, no series of escalating warnings. Just a brief moment, less than a minute, where orientation was lost, altitude was insufficient, and terrain appeared too late to avoid. And that's what makes it so haunting. Not what happened over hours, but what happened in seconds. A normal departure, a climb into darkness, and then nothing. Today, the site of the crash remains quiet. There are no large structures marking the exact point. No constant presence. Just land, that holds the memory of what happened there. For those who know the story, it's not the physical location that carries the weight. It's the understanding that something so routine can turn without warning. That even the most talented, the most experienced, the most prepared are not immune to the smallest shifts in conditions. And that sometimes the difference between arrival and tragedy is measured in visibility that fades just a little too far. Stevie Ray Vaughan left behind more than recordings. He left behind moments, performances that still feel alive, music that still carries the same intensity it did decades ago. But his story also carries a different kind of legacy, one that exists outside of music. A reminder, quiet but persistent, that in aviation, the most dangerous threats are not always the ones you can see. Sometimes, they're the ones you can't.